My name is Robert Harlan. I'm 24 years old, and for the last 3 years I've lived in Chicago, in a small one-bedroom apartment on the north side, working as a project coordinator for a healthcare logistics company. It's not a glamorous job, but it pays my rent, and more importantly, it let me buy last-minute flights home to Cleveland without asking anyone's permission. I flew home for the 5th time in 18 months on the morning of February 26, 2026. My father, Robert Harlan, was 71 years old, and he had been living with congestive heart failure for just over a year. That morning, when I let myself into the house on Larchwood Avenue with my old key, I found him sitting at the kitchen table in his robe, doing the crossword with a cup of decaf going cold beside him. "You didn't have to come," he said, not looking up, though I could hear the smile in his voice. "I know," I said. "I wanted to." That was our rhythm by then. He'd protest, I'd ignore him, and within an hour we'd be back to arguing gently about whether epi was really a 5-letter word for sword it is, or whether the Browns had any real shot next season. They didn't. I share this morning because I think it matters, because everything that came after, the funeral, the estate meeting, the armoire, the letter, none of it means what it means unless you understand that my father and I had built something quiet and real in those last 2 years. Not just phone calls, not just obligation. Actual closeness, built one 6 a.m. flight and one crossword puzzle at a time. Michael, my older brother, 35, lived 20 minutes away in Shaker Heights with his wife Kristen and their 2 kids. He came by on Sundays mostly. Sarah, my sister, 30, lived even closer, in Cleveland Heights, and stopped in maybe once every 10 days, usually with takeout and her phone in her hand the whole visit. I'm not saying this to make them into villains. They had their own lives, jobs, kids, mortgages. I understand that now more than I did then. But I also understand why, in the last year of his life, my father started keeping a notebook, and why, without any of us knowing, he began quietly making sure that the person who showed up would be the person who was protected. Part 2, the diagnosis and what changed. Cleveland, Ohio, a year earlier, February 2025. To understand the armoire, you have to understand the year before it. In February 2025, my father was diagnosed with congestive heart failure. The cardiologist gave him a plan, medication, dietary restrictions, dialysis eventually, and a guarded prognosis. He called all 3 of us the same week to tell us. I remember that call vividly. I was standing in my kitchen in Chicago at 8:15 p.m. when my phone rang, and his voice was steady in the way he always made his voice steady when something was actually terrifying him. "It's not great news, Ima," he said, "but it's not the end of the world either. I just need to be smart about things now." I asked him what he needed. He said, "Nothing really, just don't worry." 2 days later, according to the notebook I'd eventually find, he called his attorney, a man named Gregory Feld, whose office was in downtown Ravenna, about 45 minutes from Cleveland. That was the first time, as far as I can tell from his own writing, that my father started thinking seriously about what would happen to everything he owned, visible and invisible, after he was gone. Over that year, small things started to shift, though none of us noticed at the time. My father asked me casually during one of my visits what my financial situation looked like. I told him honestly, decent job, some student loan debt, no real savings to speak of, nothing dramatic. He nodded and didn't say much. He asked Michael, during a Sunday visit that spring, about the business. The landscaping company Dad had built from a single truck in 1988 into a company with 14 employees, which Michael had been managing day-to-day for the past 6 years. According to what I later pieced together, Michael's answers about certain expenses didn't quite add up, and my father noticed, even if he never said so out loud at the time. He asked Sarah's husband, Derek, nothing at all because Derek asked him first. That conversation, the one about signing the Lakewood rental over now, just to be safe, happened in June 2025, 8 months before Dad's official heart failure diagnosis worsened into something more serious. My father wrote about that conversation in his notebook with more anger than almost anything else in it. By the fall of 2025, my father had quietly begun dialysis 3 times a week. That's when my visits stopped being occasional and started being frequent, every 6 weeks, then every month then, by January 2026, nearly every 3 weeks, taking whatever time off from work I could manage, sometimes unpaid. I didn't know, while I was doing all of this, that I was also being watched, not suspiciously, but carefully, by a man deciding who in his life had shown up not because they were told to, but because they wanted to. Part 3, March 5th. Cleveland, Ohio, Thursday, March 5, 2026. My father's heart failure took a sharp turn on March 1, 2026. Sarah called me that evening, her voice tight. The doctors say it could be soon. I'm all like, soon, soon. I booked a flight for the next morning, March 2, and didn't leave Cleveland again until after the funeral. The next 4 days are hard for me to put in order, even now. I remember sitting by his hospital bed for hours. I remember him being lucid in the mornings and foggy by evening. I remember one afternoon, March 4, when he was unusually alert, and he asked me to hand him a small spiral notebook from his jacket pocket, the one he'd started carrying with him to appointments. He wrote something in it for almost 20 minutes while I sat there, not asking what it was, assuming it was medical notes for his doctors. It wasn't. It was the final entry in the notebook I would find weeks later, dated March 4, 2026, the night before he died. My father, Robert Harlan, passed away on March 5, 2026 at 11:52 p.m. at St. Vincent Charity Medical Center in Cleveland, with me holding one hand and a hospice nurse quietly checking his vitals. Michael arrived 20 minutes too late, stuck in traffic from Shaker Heights. Sarah had left an hour earlier to relieve the babysitter and never made it back in time. I don't say that to blame them. I say it because it's simply what happened, and because I think, somewhere in the back of his mind, even in his final hour, my father knew exactly who was in the room and who wasn't. Part 4, between the funeral and the reading. Cleveland, Ohio, March 9 to April 17, 2026. The funeral was held on March 9, 2026, at a funeral home on Mayfield Road, followed by burial at Lakeview Cemetery. Nearly 200 people came, old landscaping clients, neighbors from Larchwood Avenue going back 35 years, my father's church community, cousins from as far as Pittsburgh and Columbus. I stayed in Cleveland for 11 days after the funeral before flying back to Chicago on March 20. My job could only hold my position open for so long. During that time, I helped sort through some of my father's things with Sarah, mostly clothes for donation, mostly quiet, sad, ordinary work. I didn't touch the armoire during that visit. I barely thought about it. It was just a piece of furniture in the corner of a room I was trying not to fall apart in. Between March 20 and April 17, life resumed its strange, hollow normalcy. I worked. I called Sarah twice a week to check on arrangements. Michael, I learned secondhand, had been meeting with my father's attorney, Gregory Feld, to begin the process of settling the estate, though I would later learn that settling the estate and reading my father's actual will were two very different things that Michael, whether by ignorance or by design, had conflated for the rest of us. The estate meeting was scheduled for Saturday, April 18, 2026, 6 weeks after the funeral, enough time, Michael said, for probate paperwork to clear. I flew back to Cleveland on April 16, 2 days early, staying at Sarah's place in Cleveland Heights. Part 5, the reading. Cleveland, Ohio, Saturday, April 18, 2026, 10:40 a.m. By 10:40 a.m., the extended family had already left the house on Larchwood, aunts, uncles, a few neighbors who'd stopped by with casseroles that morning out of habit more than anything else. The house had gone quiet in that particular way houses go quiet after grief gets formally announced and formally closed. That's when Michael cleared his throat at the head of the kitchen table and said, "Let's just finish this today. Everyone's here. No sense dragging it out." Nobody objected. Not Sarah. Not Kristen, Michael's wife, who sat slightly behind him with a legal pad, as if she'd been preparing for this longer than the rest of us. I want to be fair here. There was a will, and it had gone through the attorney's office. But the reading, as Michael framed it that morning, was really just Michael summarizing what he understood the will to say, with occasional confirmations from Gregory Feld's paralegal over speakerphone. I didn't ask to see the actual document myself that day. I regret that now, though it wouldn't have mattered. The will itself, as it turned out, said very little about the armoire or what was hidden inside it. That part of my father's plan existed entirely outside the formal will, in a separate trust Gregory Feld had helped him quietly establish years earlier. The house on Larchwood, worth, by conservative estimate, $780,000, went to Michael, since he's the oldest and he's staying in Cleveland anyway. The Lexus, the 2 primary bank accounts, and a small rental duplex in Lakewood were split between Michael and Sarah. "Ima's out in Chicago building her own life," Sarah said, not unkindly, more like she was stating an obvious fact. "She doesn't need Dad's stuff out here." I didn't argue. I was still wearing the same black dress I'd worn to the cemetery 6 weeks earlier, because packing that morning I hadn't been able to think clearly enough to choose anything else. I didn't have the energy to fight, and some tired, quiet part of me thought, let them have it. You have your own life in Chicago. Let it go. Then Michael looked around the kitchen, as if searching for something to hand me so I wouldn't leave completely empty-handed. His eyes landed on the corner of Dad's bedroom, visible through the open door. "Ima, take Dad's old armoire," he said, almost laughing. "Nobody else wants that thing anyway." That got a real laugh. Kristen even smiled behind her legal pad. Derek, Sarah's husband, shook his head and muttered something about how it was probably worth more as firewood. The armoire, a 100-year-old wooden wardrobe that had belonged to my grandfather, its finish long worn away, one door hanging slightly off its hinges, a smell of cedar and old paper drifting out whenever you opened it. It had survived a basement flood in 1997, 2 house moves, and at least one attempt by my mother, years before she passed away in 2014, to have it hauled to the dump. "Sure," I said quietly. "I'll take the armoire." Nobody in that kitchen knew, not even me, not yet, that in 6 days, that broken piece of furniture would turn their entire division of the estate into the biggest mistake any of them had ever made. Part 6, What My Uncle Said. Cleveland, Ohio, Monday, April 20, 2026, 6:15 p.m. I wasn't scheduled to fly back to Chicago until April 24. I had 4 days left, and I spent most of them quietly going through my father's things, while Michael and Sarah were busy calling movers and title companies. And while Kristen, I noticed, had already started measuring the living room for new furniture. On the evening of April 20, my father's younger brother, Uncle Dale, 68, a retired high school shop teacher who'd known my dad since they were boys in Akron, stopped by to check on me. We sat together in Dad's room, half empty now, most of his clothes already boxed up for donation, and I noticed Uncle Dale's eyes kept drifting to the old armoire still sitting in the corner. "You got stuck with that?" he asked, nodding at it. "Everyone else got the house, the car, the money," I said, trying to smile. "I got the furniture nobody wanted." Uncle Dale didn't laugh. He went quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee mug slowly in his hands, and then he said something I'll never forget. "Your dad called me about 3 weeks before he passed. He was already pretty weak by then, but sharp as ever on the phone. He told me, 'Dale, if anything happens to me, make sure Emma doesn't let go of that armoire. Tell her, no matter what her brother and sister say, that thing belongs to her and only her.' I asked him why. He just said, 'She'll understand when the time comes. She's the only one who ever really slowed down long enough to see me.' I stared at him, my throat tightening. 'Why didn't you say anything at the house on Saturday?' He looked down at his hands, weathered from decades of shop class and woodworking. 'Because Michael runs those meetings like a board meeting, Ima, and I've learned over 68 years that it's better to say something quiet to the right person than something loud to the wrong room. Your dad trusted me with that message. He didn't trust me to deliver it in front of your brother.' We sat in silence for a while after that, both of us looking at the armoire like it might say something itself. 'There's one more thing,' Uncle Dale said eventually, standing up to leave. 'He asked me back in January whether I still had my old tools. I said sure. He asked if I could look at a latch mechanism sometime, something small, custom. I didn't think much of it at the time. Now I wonder if he wasn't asking me to help him build something into that thing. That night at 11:30 p.m., once the house had finally gone silent and Sarah had gone home to Cleveland Heights, I sat in front of the armoire with the flashlight on my phone, my heart pounding harder than it had at the funeral itself. Part 7, The False Bottom. Cleveland, Ohio, Monday, April 20, 2026, 11:47 p.m. The armoire had 3 shelves and a lower cabinet where Dad used to keep old sweaters and a few manila folders. I'd already looked through it once, briefly, back in March, and found nothing but faded flannel shirts, a broken pocket watch, and a shoebox of old photographs from the 1990s. But that night, remembering what Uncle Dale had told me, I looked again, properly this time. I emptied the lower cabinet completely, ran my hands along every seam, and knocked along the bottom panel the way you'd knock on a wall checking for a stud. One corner sounded different, deeper, hollow. My hands were shaking as I ran my fingers along the seam until I found a small wooden latch disguised as a knot in the grain, no bigger than a quarter. Clean, precise work, the kind of careful craftsmanship I now understood Uncle Dale had probably helped install. I pressed it. The panel lifted slightly, like the lid of a very old cigar box. Underneath was a thin compartment, maybe 3 inches deep, lined with felt that had once been green and was now the color of weak tea. Inside were 4 things, one more than I'd expected. A sealed envelope with my name on it, in my father's handwriting, Ima, my daughter. A set of property documents, official and old, stamped by the Portage County Recorder's Office, dated 1994. A small spiral notebook filled with my father's neat, slanted handwriting, entries spanning many years, the earliest from 2003, the last dated March 4, 2026, the night before he died. A folded business card for Gregory Feld, attorney at law, with a Ravenna address and a personal cell number handwritten on the back. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the cold floor of his room and read until sunrise, until the sky outside his window turned pale gray at 6:00 a.m., and I could hear the first birds starting up in the maple tree out front. Part 8, What Dad Wrote. The letter was 3 pages, handwritten front and back, the handwriting steadier at the top of the first page and noticeably shakier by the end of the third. A physical record, I realized, of how much this letter had cost him to write across what must have been several sittings. I won't put every word here. Some of it belongs only to me, a daughter reading her father's last private thoughts. But the truth in it changed everything. My father wrote that in 1994, when Michael was 3 years old. Sarah wasn't yet born, and my father was still building the landscaping business one contract at a time. He'd taken a risk and bought 40 acres of farmland outside Ravenna, Ohio, land not far from where he'd grown up. Land his own father had once pointed to and said, half joking, "Somebody in this family should own that someday." He bought it with savings he kept separate from the business and separate from the household accounts. Money he never told my mother about, not out of dishonesty. He insisted in the letter. But because in the early years he was terrified the business would fail and he wanted one thing, just one thing, that creditors could never touch. He leased the land to a local farming family for over 30 years and simply let it sit, appreciating quietly, forgotten by everyone but him. Why hide it for so long, even after the business succeeded? The notebook explained that too, in plain, painful language, across dozens of entries I read that night and in the weeks after. He wrote that over the last decade he'd watched Michael quietly move money out of the business accounts. Small amounts at first, categorized as equipment maintenance or fuel costs, then larger ones. Always with an explanation that sounded reasonable on its own, but strange in aggregate. He'd hired an old friend, an accountant named Phyllis Grunwald, in the fall of 2024 to quietly review 5 years of company books without telling Michael why. Her findings, which he summarized in the notebook, suggested somewhere between $60,000 and $90,000 in expenses that didn't clearly map to any actual business purpose. He wrote that Derek, Sarah's husband, had asked him directly, during a cookout in June 2025, to sign the Lakewood duplex over to Sarah before something happens to your health, just to be safe. 8 months before my father's condition officially worsened into the phase that led to dialysis. My father wrote about that conversation with more raw anger than almost anything else in the notebook, describing how he'd smiled and changed the subject at the cookout, then gone home and sat alone in his study for 2 hours afterward. And he wrote about me, plainly, without exaggeration, in a tone that felt less like flattery and more like simple bookkeeping, the same way he'd once kept careful books for his business. He wrote that when he got sick and needed someone to sit with him at 2 a.m. during a bad night, to drive him to dialysis 3 times a week during the last year of his life, to remember his medication schedule down to the half hour, to simply be there on ordinary Tuesday afternoons when nothing dramatic was happening, and there was no urgent reason to show up. It was never Michael, and it was never Sarah. It was me, calling every single night from Chicago at whatever hour worked around his dialysis schedule, and flying back 5 times in 13 months, using my own savings and missing work I couldn't really afford to miss, because I couldn't stand the thought of him being alone. He wrote that he hadn't even told me he was tracking any of this. He said he didn't want me showing up out of an awareness that I was being watched or measured. He wanted to know, honestly, who would come without an audience, and I had. He didn't know, when he wrote most of these entries, that I'd also be sitting quietly in that kitchen on April 18, watching his life's work get divided by people who hadn't been present at the end. But by the final entry, dated the night before he died, it's clear he'd made his peace with exactly how that day would probably go. Ima, if they've already handed you that armoire as a joke, laughing like it's worthless, know that your old man was smarter than his own children gave him credit for. That armoire was never a joke to me. It's where I decided to keep the one thing your brother and sister could never argue over, because they'd never think to look. The land outside Ravenna is held in a private trust I set up with Gregory Feld in 2019, and you are the sole beneficiary. His number is on the card in this box, and he already has instructions waiting for your call. Call him before you call your brother. Forgive them, Ima, if you can. They are not bad people, just people who got comfortable assuming things would simply come to them. But don't let them take this from you, too. You gave me your time while I was alive, more of it than I probably deserved, and you never once asked what you'd get for it. Let me give you something back now, while I still have the chance to decide. I love you. I have loved watching you become who you are. Dad. The land, based on the documents and a rough estimate from a local realtor days later, was worth roughly $1.4 million, driven up by new highway development plans near Ravenna that my father, it turned out, had been quietly tracking in the notebook for the past 2 years. More than the Larchwood house Michael had so quickly claimed for himself. Part 9. Gregory Feld's office. Ravenna, Ohio, Wednesday, April 22, 2026, 1:00 p.m. I called the number on the card the next morning, my voice unsteady. A woman answered, and when I gave my name, she said simply, "We've been expecting your call, Ms. Harlan. Mr. Feld can see you tomorrow at 1 if that works." Gregory Feld's office was a small, old-fashioned suite above a hardware store on Ravenna's Main Street, the kind of place with wood paneling and a coffee machine that looked older than me. He was in his early 60s, gray-haired, careful in his speech, and clearly moved as he pulled out a thick folder with my father's name on it. "Your father came to me in 2019, he said, not long after his own father, your grandfather, passed away and left him thinking hard about legacy. He told me directly, in this office, that he loved all 3 of his children, but that he'd watched enough families fall apart over money to know that fairness isn't the same thing as equal. He wanted to protect one thing quietly, for whoever showed up for him the way he hoped someone would. He confirmed everything. The trust, established in 2019, funded with the Ravenna property. My status as sole beneficiary. The fact that the trust existed entirely separate from the will Michael had read at the kitchen table on April 18, meaning nothing about my portion had ever been up for family debate in the first place. Michael simply hadn't known it existed, because my father had never told him. He updated it twice, Feld added, sliding a page across the desk. Once in 2022, and again just this past January, after he asked Phyllis Grunwald to review the business books. That's when he added the language about the accounts. I sat in that office for almost 2 hours, going through paperwork, signing things, asking questions I hadn't even known I needed to ask. When I finally stood to leave, Feld walked me to the door and said something that stuck with me the whole drive back to Cleveland. In 31 years of doing this work, Ms. Harlan, I've seen a lot of parents try to buy fairness with money, splitting everything down the middle so nobody can complain. Your father didn't do that. He tried to reward truth. That's rarer than you'd think and harder to build. He talked about you every single time I saw him. I just want you to know that. Part 10, The Confrontation. Cleveland, Ohio, Thursday, April 23, 2026, 8:30 p.m. I didn't want revenge. I want to be honest about that, because it would be easy to tell this story like the youngest daughter triumphantly humiliates her siblings and rides off into the sunset. That's not what happened, and it's not what I wanted, even in my angriest moments reading that notebook at 3 a.m. What I wanted was for the truth to exist out loud, the way my father, in his own quiet way, had finally allowed it to. I called a small family meeting the night before my flight back to Chicago. Michael, Sarah, and their spouses sat around the same kitchen table where, 5 days earlier, they'd joked about handing me a broken armoire. I set the trust documents, the property records, and my father's notebook on the table, along with Feld's business card, still sitting on top like a small, quiet warning. Nobody laughed this time. Michael went pale first, reaching for the notebook before pulling his hand back, like it might burn him. Sarah picked it up instead, flipping through pages with trembling hands, reading dates and dollar amounts that matched, almost exactly, times Michael had told everyone he was reinvesting in equipment for the landscaping company. "This isn't," Michael started, his voice cracking in a way I'd never heard before. "Dad didn't understand the business. Cash flow doesn't work the way he—" $60,000 to $90,000, Michael, I said quietly. "Over 5 years. Phyllis Grunwald has the full report if you want to see it. Dad hired her himself quietly in 2024. He didn't have an answer for that. Kristen's legal pad stayed closed the whole meeting. Sarah was the one who finally said something honest, setting the notebook down carefully, almost gently, like it deserved more respect than she'd shown the armoire 6 days earlier. "We thought it was a joke gift. We didn't know." "I know you didn't know," I said. "That was the point. He didn't trust you to know, not because he didn't love you, but because he'd watched Derek try to get the Lakewood property signed over 8 months before his diagnosis even got serious. That's in here too, Sarah." Derek's face went red, and he looked away out the kitchen window, saying nothing at all. "I'm not here to fight about the house or the car," I told them, and I meant it even then. "Dad gave those to you and Sarah, fair and square, in an actual will that went through actual probate. I'm not trying to take that back, and I don't want to. I'm here because he also gave me something separately, quietly, on his own terms, and he made absolutely sure that nobody could pretend afterward that I didn't deserve it." Nobody said the word sorry that night. Grief and guilt don't always come out as apology. Sometimes they just come out as silence. The kind that sits in a room like a fourth sibling nobody invited, taking up a chair, refusing to leave. We sat there for a while, the 4 of them and me, the kitchen clock ticking past 9 p.m. and then past 9:30 until finally Michael stood up, walked to the window and said quietly, mostly to himself, "He never said anything. All those Sundays. He never once said anything to my face." "Would you have changed anything if he had?" I asked. He didn't answer that either. I think, honestly, none of us knew. Part 11, Ravenna again. Ravenna, Ohio, Saturday, April 25, 2026, 3:15 p.m. Before flying back to Chicago, I pushed my flight 3 days and drove out to Ravenna, about 45 minutes southeast of Cleveland, to see the land with my own eyes for the first time in my life. The tenant farmer, a man named Walt Hollies, 74, had worked that land since before I was born, leasing it from my father every year without ever meeting me. When I told him who I was, standing at the edge of a cornfield still low and green with early spring growth. He actually got choked up, wiping his face with the back of his sleeve, and told me my father used to drive out twice a year, quietly, telling no one, just to walk the property and talk with him about crops and weather, and sometimes about his kids back in Cleveland. He talked about you the most, Walt told me, leaning against his truck. Said, my youngest calls me every single night from Chicago just to make sure I ate dinner. Doesn't matter if it's late her time, doesn't matter if she's tired. She calls. He was real proud of you, I'm real proud. Told me once he figured you didn't even realize how rare that was. He showed me around for almost 2 hours. The property line marked by an old stone wall his own father had helped my grandfather build decades earlier. A small pond near the eastern edge where he said my dad used to sit sometimes, alone, just thinking, and a weathered wooden sign, barely legible, that read Harlan Farm, ESD. 1994, which Walt told me my father had put up himself, quietly, the same week he'd bought the land, long before any of it meant anything to anyone but him. I stood there at 4:40 p.m. as the sun went gold over the cornfields. My father had kept secret for over 30 years, and I finally cried the way I hadn't let myself cry at the funeral, or the estate meeting, or any of the 40 days between them. Not sad crying exactly, but something closer to relief, like finally setting down something heavy I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. Walt let me stay as long as I wanted. When I finally got back in my rental car to drive back to Cleveland Heights, he knocked on my window one more time. Whatever you decide to do with this place, he said, your dad would just want you to be happy here. That's all he ever wanted. He said that to me more than once. Part 12, Epilogue. Chicago, Illinois, Monday, May 4, 2026, 9:00 p.m. I flew back to Chicago on April 28, landing at O'Hare at 6:40 p.m., exhausted and jet-lagged, carrying one small wooden box in my carry-on, my father's notebook, still wrapped in that same faded felt cloth, along with a folder of paperwork Feld had prepared for me and a small mason jar of soil Walt had insisted I take from the edge of the cornfield. So you've got a little piece of it with you out there. The attorney in Ravenna confirmed everything within 2 weeks. The trust was valid, properly filed, entirely separate from probate, untouchable by anyone but me. I kept the tenant lease with Walt Holly's in place. He'd earned that much loyalty over 30 years, and honestly, some part of me liked knowing that land was still being worked, still growing something, the way my father would have wanted. I still talk to Sarah sometimes. Things are polite, if not close, a few texts around holidays, a phone call on my birthday that felt a little more careful than it used to. Michael and I haven't spoken much since that night at the kitchen table, though I've heard, through relatives, that Phyllis Grunwald's full report eventually led to a quiet, difficult conversation between him and Kristen about the business finances. One that, according to Uncle Dale, ended with Michael agreeing to pay back what he could slowly, without anyone involving lawyers or the police. I don't know if that's real accountability or just damage control. I've decided it's not entirely my job to know. Sometimes, late at night, in my apartment on the north side, I think about that kitchen full of people laughing when Michael handed me the armoire. Nobody's fault, really. Just a family being a family, quick to assume the youngest. The one who'd moved away wouldn't mind getting the leftovers. I think about how easy it would have been for me to let that moment define the whole story. The daughter who got the broken furniture while her siblings got the house, and the car and the money. They didn't know what was inside it. Honestly, I didn't know either, not until Uncle Dale sat with me in that quiet room and told me to look twice. But my dad knew exactly what he was doing, all along, for years, quietly, without ever once asking for credit or announcing his plan. He didn't leave me his biggest asset outright, sitting in plain view for anyone to argue over. He left me the one thing none of them thought to want, a piece of broken, unwanted furniture. And inside it, he left me proof of every quiet act of love I'd given him that no one else had ever been in the room to see. He turned the very thing they mocked into the safest place he could think to hide the truth. 40 days after his death, at that kitchen table on Larchwood Avenue, I lost the house, the car, and the bank accounts. I didn't mind. Because in a broken old armoire, held together by nothing but hinges, cedar, and one honest man's last wishes. My father made absolutely sure I would never again feel like the child who got nothing. And made sure, too, that the story of who really showed up for him would outlive every argument at that table. The end. Total reading time. Approximately 50 minutes at a natural narration pace.